Welcome to the guide, Exile. If you're looking for a strong, immovable force that can stroll through lab traps, AFK in the face of danger, or spend time learning the mechanics of endgame fights, then you have come to the right place. This is the THICC JUGG Mark II. As I mentioned in one of my prior videos, I was planning on reworking the THICC JUGG tank build that I had originally made back in 3.0. Since then, there have been many changes to the Ascendancies, passive tree, and items, such that we can remake this build even stronger. In this variation of the build, we are keeping many of the same ideas, but swapping almost all of the items and skills around to bring our mitigations, life, and damage up. Of course, you can still use the prior iteration of the build if it suits you, as this version will ultimately be a hybrid of the THICC JUGG original build and the Jug of all trades. Remember, the main focus of this build is to be a tank or a thick boy, and as such we do not focus on damage. The goal is to be an easy to get into Eternal Labyrinth farmer for new or veteran players that do not want to worry about mechanics or failure. So we focus on getting a lot of defensive layers, and only get as much damage as we need to complete the content that this build is geared for, the Eternal Labyrinth. As such, we are also considering the budget that is viable for League starting and getting into Labyrinth farming. This means we will also be looking to use cheap starting items that you can get within the first few days of a League and still be effective, not multiple Exalt items that could make the damage much higher. We just want to be a thick boy and work Azaro into submission. However, this build can be taken to some of the endgame content and complete many of the encounters there just fine, albeit slowly. As a side note, all of the footage seen in this guide is being done on a 5-link to keep it a true budget build. With this iteration of the THICC JUGG, I wanted to amplify the offensive power of the build while still maintaining the defensive power of it. Somehow I was able to do both of these things and keep the build at a reasonable budget. I also wanted to keep the build as cheap as possible for someone starting the League and going right into Labyrinth farming. In the first few days of the League, you can get this build operational to farm Eternal Labyrinth for dirt cheap, only needing a decent life pool, somewhere around 5,000 plus, resistances at cap, and any 5-link armor with a decent weapon. The Jug Ascendancy will take care of the rest. In this iteration, we are foregoing many of the item choices that we had previously, as we are now not pure physical and bleed focused. We will discuss all the itemization choices in the gearing section, and speak to the high-level offensive and defensive summary here. Offensively, we will be dropping Cleave as our main skill in favor of Reeve and Blade Flurry, as there are now more prominent and strong stat-stick offhand weapons that can be used with such skills. As we all know from my previous few guides, the Elder's Nebulok unique weapon is a great choice here. Of course, if you wish, you can also use other skills such as Vol Double Strike, or even swap in Lacerate. The reason we are moving away from Cleave is that we have another way of obtaining Fortify, with a percentage chance to gain Fortify on melee hit of Vol Corruption, which is fairly easy to obtain on common unique weapons, such as the Ichimonji Sword. We are using that here in this build still for the buff effect, reduced mana, and decent damage, and the commonality of the item leads to it being a good selection for this Vol Corruption. On top of our main skill, we have Vol Ancestral Warchief and Flask to provide supporting damage and utility. Finally, due to the eased gearing in this variation, we are able to easily hit our resistance cap without the purities on, and thus we are able to swap auras depending on the scenario. This lets us drop our elemental purities and instead turn on something like Hatred and Herald of Purity for more damage if we so require it. Unfortunately, due to the changes to the offensive side, it's hard to give an exact one-to-one comparison of the damage gain since we are initially using different skills as well as bleed. But from my play experience, the damage is certainly higher. So now that covers the offensive portion, now we have to go on to our defenses. Defensively, we have almost all the same layers as before with some new additions. So I'll list out the previous ones with their alterations and speak to the new ones. We get 7 total endurance charges in this variation for 28% physical mitigation. We also have to remember that we get 8% reduced elemental damage taken at maximum endurance charges. We can gain even more physical mitigation through armor, and with our doubled chest value, we can easily hit anywhere between 20 to 48,000 armor. The Tukohama and Lunaris Pantheons can give us up to 16% flat physical mitigation, as well as 2% life regeneration. Fortify, scaled through Ichimonji and Rampart, will give us 25% increased Fortify effect, for a total of 25% reduced damage taken from hits. Arctic Armor will give us 14% less physical damage and 13% less fire damage taken from hits. This is almost equivalent to Purity of Fire for hits in terms of reduction. Purity of Ice and Lightning. Since we use Arctic Armor to reduce our fire damage taken, these purities give us 5% to our maximum cold and lightning resistance at gem level 20 with the aura nodes and Ichimonji Sword. This is a desirable setup for when Azaro has many elemental buffs. Enfeeble and Blind. We are cursing offending monsters with Enfeeble after we are hit to reduce their damage and making them less accurate. We also can apply Blind with either a Stibnite or an Abyss Jewel. This makes them very unlikely to hit us after they've also been enfeebled. We make use of a very large life pool as our buffer to eat any damage that we do take. Depending on itemization, we can get up to 8,000 life. This not only gives us a big buffer to take any type of damage, but scales our leech and regen speeds relative to incoming damage, making it very important to get a big life pool. Now finally we have leech and regen. We take maximum leech rate nodes to get a 26% of our life pool leech per second, as well as 12% of our life regenerated per second. This will help sustain during fights and through lab traps. And now finally, our new defensive layer, which is ultimately just the Nebulock. But this item provides more than just one stat that is very useful to us. With all of our buffs, we will have 28% chaos resistance, 7% reduced elemental damage taken, 35 to 56 physical damage added to our attacks, and 3,500 armor. Now it does have the downside of dealing 200 fire damage per second per endurance charge that we have when we are hit. Luckily, between our fire resistance and life regeneration, this damage barely does anything, and it is fully worth it for the benefits that we get from this weapon. This weapon does not make or break the build, but it does provide a wealth of offense and defensive power. With all these layers put together, we are able to bring our mitigations down even further than before. Here are the defensive stat comparisons between the first iteration THICC JUGG and the current one, without the use of any flasks against a 6,000 damage physical hit. These numbers represent the adjusted percentage coefficient of damage taken from these sources via hits or damage over time. Even though it is a small gain, we are gaining more defenses at the loss of a small amount of regeneration. This is mainly due to the loss of a Combs Way and introduction of a Nebulock. Physical damage is reduced by an extra 6%, Chaos by 14%, and Elemental by 1%. Now for the playstyle of the build. It's quite similar to what it was before, as we just face tank everything that we can. Of course, there will be some more than deadly map modifier combinations or encounters that you cannot face tank. In maps, you will be using Reave, Lacerate, or possibly Vol Double Strike. Make sure to start and maintain your Blood Rage at all times for the attack speed and Frenzy Charge generation. Leap Slam from pack to pack, and use Flasks. For map bosses, you can simply swap to Concentrated Effect on area skills, or swap Ancestral Callout for name lock skills. Drop an Ancestral and a Vol Ancestral Warchief Totem and then go to town. For Eternal Lab or endgame bosses, you will want to swap to Blade Flurry as your main skill with Concentrated Effect for maximum damage, using supporting skills such as Warchief Totems, Blood Rage, and Flasks whenever possible. As I talked about in my last few Juggernaut videos, you can now use the Gluttony Belt prior to instance encounters, such as Azaro, to gain endurance charges. This works as the Gluttony Belt triggers a hit on yourself when you use a movement skill, thus proccing the Juggernaut's unflinching endurance charge generation. This makes the beginning of these fights much safer. Now on to the rest of the build choices. The path of building Paste Bin is included within the written script and description of the video. There's no question as to what Ascendancy we are, so let's just cover the nodes we pick. Unstoppable. This is an excellent node to not only provide more movement speed, but from you ever being slowed below base speed. This makes you immune to temporal chains and many other slows such as chill and freeze, which can occur very often in the lab. Unbreakable. Here we get generic reduction, life regeneration, and doubling of body armor rating. On top of this, we also get a lot of conditional life regeneration based on the amount of physical damage we reduce, which is quite a lot. Unflinching. The main endurance charge generator of the build, along with an endurance charge. Unrelenting, one of the most defensive nodes we can get, providing 1% additional physical reduction and 4% chaos resistance to each endurance charge, along with 8% reduced elemental damage taken at maximum charges. Here's the Ascendancy progression. Here's the final passive tree. We focus on getting all the life nodes within our immediate vicinity, along with each endurance charge and getting applicable damage nodes. At the bottom of the tree we gather aura nodes to ensure we get the +5 to maximum resistance from the elemental purity auras, along with enough reduced reservation to use all of the auras at once. Next to that node we also get the fortify nodes to increase its effect as much as possible. For bandits we kill all of them. Here are our Pantheon choices. For major we choose Soul of Lunaris. This is for the extra physical mitigation it can provide in the Azaro fights, as he generally spawns skeletons and other buffs that flood the arena. For minor we choose Soul of Tukahama. Since we are standing still most of the time, this is a great choice to further increase our physical mitigation and life regeneration. Of course, these can be swapped depending on situations. There are many different options for the main skill here, and ultimately you can use any that works with a sword, but for now I will just lay out the ones that I feel are best. The gems are listed in order of importance. Drop the last gem if you do only have a 5 link. For mapping, I choose between Reave or Lacerate with increased area of effect. These are great choices, and Reeve can also have a Vol variant which gives more area of effect. These also swap out very easily for Blade Flurry when we want to do serious boss damage. Culling Strike is excellent for killing Azaro off in the last Aspirant's Trial. If you cannot get Fortify on your weapon, you can swap it in here for Blood Rage, moving that one into one of the weapons. These are placed in a 3-socket set of Tomb Fists. Since we intend on getting a corrupted Ichimonji, I generally consider these sockets non-existent for planning purposes. However, finding one with a red and green socket shouldn't be too hard, and you can socket in these auras for when you want to use a more offensive setup over the elemental purities. The only issue with this current setup is you cannot weapon swap when using these, so you might want to recolor your gloves if you intend on using these auras in the labyrinth consistently. Otherwise, in general map use, weapon swap should not be necessary. As with most all builds, and especially League starter builds like this one, you can most certainly start with rares in all slots. Rares are actually great to have in most of the slots in this build. Remember that if you want to make use of either defensive or offensive aura setup, you will want to gear without elemental purities on. The main choice for a helmet is a rare with a lot of life, armor, resistances, and possibly intelligence if you can get it. There are not really any great unique helmets to work into this build. Here's where we can make a big change from the original build. Instead of using Belly of the Beast, we can now have access to Elder Rare body armors. These have percentage increased life and or percentage increased strength, along with a bunch of other flat life modifiers that can make it much more powerful than a belly. Here I ended up with a really lucky essence craft that only took me one try. Of course, in the beginning of the league, it'll be a bit more difficult to get one of these armor bases with a reasonably high item level, so you can always just start with a basic rare chest. I highly recommend just looking for a good 5-link rare with life, armor, strength, or resistances, or you could buy a white 5-link and essence or alchemy orbit a few times to get something usable. For the gloves, we aim to get Tomb Fists. These are mainly for damage boost and can be easily replaced by rares. You'll want to socket a Murderous Eye Jewel in these to ensure hit enemies are intimidated for the extra damage. If you just want to run Labyrinth and you feel you have enough damage, you can also get an Essence of Insanity crafted pair of gloves to put your Leap Slam in here instead, increasing your Leap Slam speed. Boots are the usual affair, looking for lots of life, movement speed, and resistances. Movement speed isn't really required, but is a nice quality of life in most scenarios. The belt of choice for me is ultimately a rare Stygian Vise with life and resistances. This allows us to socket another Abyss Jewel in for more damage, utility, and life. If you cannot get a decent Stygian, a regular leather belt works just as good. The Perseverance is also a great unique alternative. The amulet is a main source of missing attributes for us, along with a great item to get for offensive stats. Look for one with as much life as possible, along with missing attributes and offensive stats such as flat physical damage to attacks, elemental damage with attacks, or strength. If you are able to get an Elder base amulet, you can also look for physical gained as fire or non-chaos damage gained as chaos. The rings are a great way to fill in the rest of your missing resistance. Also keep an eye out for any remaining stats that you need, along with life and offensive modifiers such as flat physical damage to attacks or elemental damage with attacks. For our main set of weapons, we will be using the following. An Ichimonji. This weapon provides a decent amount of damage, excellent attack speed, reduced mana reserved, and increased buff effect. This buff effect can only be sourced from these weapons, and enhances Fortify and any auras you have. This is also a very common weapon and can be found with the percentage chance to gain Fortify on melee hit corruption quite easily. Our offhand will be the Nebulock. This is an excellent offhand choice for the Juggernaut, as we have so many endurance charges that are always up to get the buffs from this weapon at all times. I highly recommend getting this weapon as soon as possible, but if you cannot get it, you can always just get a non-sword, claw, or dagger weapon in the offhand and ensure that you are dual wielding. You can also start with a cheap Shaper Axe, Mace, or Scepter that has one or more affixes of gain percentage of physical damage as X element. The second weapon set is purely for leap slamming faster within the Labyrinth. We will main hand a Brightbeak, which has one of the highest local attack speed modifiers on it, increasing the base attack speed of Leap Slam. In our offhand, we use a Prismatic Eclipse with 3 green sockets. The 3 green sockets provide a total of 36% increased global attack speed, which no other weapons can do. Putting both of these together, you get an incredibly fast Leap Slam to move through any situation. Remember that this weapon swap is just for moving around and not necessarily for dealing damage. You will want to swap back to your main weapon setup for real fights, however many basic enemies in the Labyrinth can be killed with this weapon set. Here I'll go through the final flask choices I've made for the build, but you can certainly start with basic magic utility and life flasks. A Lion's Roar, a go-to for melee builds, which is a pure percentage more multiplier. If you do not like the knockback, you can always drop it for another flask, but Azaro and many other bosses you fight will not be able to be knocked back. And Atziri's Promise for good damage and extra chaos resistance. Sulfur Flask. This is great for damage and more regeneration while we face tank. Silver Flask, to add some more speed to the build. This flask can of course be dropped for more defensive one if you require it, or if you have the Perseverance belt. Forbidden Taste. Since we get so much life, regular life flasks really do not do much for us. A Forbidden Taste recovers a percentage of our life, making it always useful, and only deals a small amount of chaos damage, of which we mitigate quite easily. I only recommend getting this flask once you have a Nebulock and Final Ascendancy node, and prior to that I suggest a normal Divine Life flask. For jewels, I will show the example ones used in my video, and leave the affix priority in the written guide. For your basic jewel, you will want to be getting percentage of physical damage leached as mana. This is what sustains your main skill usage after you move on from using Mana Flask while leveling. Otherwise, you will want to prioritize life and attack speed. For Abyss jewels, you will want to look for life, damage, and utility where you can, such as percentage chance to blind enemies on hit with attacks. For leveling information, check out the written guide. With that, you now have your freshly upgraded THICC Jugg to take on the Eternal Lab and whatever else you wish to min-max the build to take on. Lab traps barely scrape the skin, Argus hits like a wet noodle, and Azaro is baffled by your resilience. I hope that this rework has tickled your fancy and provides you even more success in Labyrinth farming. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, Exile.